Hello again, everyone. So for this video, picking up where we left on our last video, we're going to be looking at the New Deal and FDR. Specifically for this video, I want to focus on a period of what's sometimes called the First New Deal, a period of legislative activity at the beginning of FDR's presidency, of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, that has since become kind of this metric by which all American presidents are measured, a period known as the 100 Days, during which a tremendous amount of activity is undertaken. New laws are passed, new policies are created, new agencies are created. Some of it's very effective, some of it not so, and some ends up having rather serious unintended consequences. But it is a period nonetheless that, because of just the sheer amount that is done in such a relatively brief time, has become the metric by which all future American presidents are measured. How much they can accomplish in their first 100 days in office is, still to this day something that is written about extensively um, whenever there's a new president. And that's in large part because of what happened during this period of the New Deal. Now, basically, when Roosevelt assumes office, like I said, he doesn't necessarily have a specific ideology or philosophy that he's planning to enact. Unlike today, where when we look at these sort of things and how to handle a depression, we kind of have the benefit of, history and this example of history to look at. Roosevelt is kind of, off the grid, so to speak. He's kind of going into uncharted territory. There's never been a depression like this, at least not one that had lasted this long by this point. The depressions of the 19th century, some of them are actually a bit more severe than the Great Depression of the 1930s, but they're typically very short in duration, 2-3 years max. By the time Roosevelt takes office, the depression is already well into its third, almost fourth year. So this is, kind of uncharted territory. And nobody had really ever tried to do the kind of things that Roosevelt and his team ultimately decided to try to do during this period. So this is all very unprecedented. And as a result, there's this kind of, throw everything at the wall kind of approach. And, some things stick and work and some things don't. But it's definitely this period that's characterized by this intense amount of activity. Now, a lot of that activity comes as a result of the people who surround FDR, his so-called brain trust, which includes the first female cabinet secretary, Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins, who was the first woman ever to hold an executive level position of that kind. And she would ultimately prove to be one of the most important members of Roosevelt's administration, playing a major role in many of the policies that were enacted in the second half of his first term, um, such as Social Security and labor relations and all that kind of stuff. But the first things that Roosevelt and his team of advisors really want to tackle is fundamentally their objectives are very simple. They want to restart the economy, and they want to, kind of fix the causes of the Depression. But what they're fundamentally not trying to do is they're not trying to move the United States in a direction that abandons either democracy or capitalism. So he's not in favor of things of actual full-on socialist things like, say, for example, nationalizing the banks or the railroads or anything like that. Instead, Roosevelt recognizes that, lax regulation, a lack of meaningful oversight, those sort of things had helped create the conditions that led to the Great Depression. And so instead, he proposes, um, a greater role for government in regulating business, but still maintaining the the capitalist system that the U.S. has. So he's not, in fact, as many portray him as some sort of, you know, socialist or communist or anything like that. He's actually um, what in most countries outside the United States would be considered a social democrat, someone who, you know, sees a kind of private government partnership and, you know, tries to meaningfully regulate business. Anyway, um, so the first thing that Roosevelt decides he wants to focus his attention on once he's elected in office is one of the biggest issues that was facing the country at the time, which was the near total collapse of the banking industry. Basically, in the aftermath of the Great Depression and the collapse of the stock market, thousands upon thousands of banks in the United States during the Hoover era failed, and as a result, millions of people lost their life savings, college funds, housing funds, what have you, as banks very quickly folded up. More often than not, the reason why these banks folded is because of so-called runs that would occur, where people would hear that a bank was in trouble and they would all flock to the bank all at once to try to withdraw all their money at the same time. This would create, in effect, a self-fulfilling prophecy, causing these banks to lose their funding and ultimately become insolvent. This is something that was actually captured very well in the 1946 film "It's a Wonderful Life" with Jimmy Stewart. If I can find a clip of it, I'll post that in the videos to kind of show you what a bank run actually looked like at this time period. So banks are in danger because of this. Another issue is, of course, that you have a lot of people being foreclosed upon, and one of the biggest causes of this is that many banks became in danger of being insolvent, not just from these runs, but because in many cases their finances were very tightly tied up and intermingled between the kind of housing and farm loans and savings accounts of their regular customers and speculative activity on Wall Street. And so literally the first thing that Roosevelt does once he becomes president, once he's inaugurated, he has Congress pass an emergency banking holiday that orders all of the banks in the United States closed for several days. In the interim, he has inspectors look at the records of these banks to determine whether or not they can remain solvent and whether or not they should or should not reopen. About 3/4 of the banks following this emergency bank holiday are then allowed to reopen. After the emergency bank holiday, Congress then passes a law known as the Glass-Steagall Act. And the Glass-Steagall Act is actually a law with two major provisions that are both very important, and which would become the centerpiece of American banking reform in the 20th century, and as such would provide a level of stability to the financial industry and to the banking sector that would endure throughout the 20th century. Basically, what the Glass-Steagall Act did, the first thing it did, is to reassure those wary, kind of mom and pop type people who were worried that if they didn't immediately withdraw all their money from the bank, that their life savings would go up in smoke, and have to stash it under the mattress, as many had taken to doing at this point. The first thing that the Glass-Steagall Act did is it creates a new program in the banking industry called the Federal Depositors Insurance Corporation. If you go to any bank today and you look at the teller's window, you'll oftentimes still see an FDIC logo on there. What that does is it basically means that any money you put into the bank up to a certain amount is insured by the federal government in the event of that bank's failure, so that if the bank goes belly up, you don't lose your money, basically. And so that's the first thing that the FDIC does. It gives this guarantee, this insurance policy, literally, to Americans that if you put your money in the bank, it'll be okay. You're not gonna, if the bank goes belly up, you're not gonna lose your money. The federal government will reimburse you if your money's lost up to a certain amount. Um, so that's the first thing it does. The second thing that the Glass-Steagall Act does is it puts a wall of sorts of separation between the functions of commercial and investment banking. Basically, you have two types of banks. There are investment banks, which engage in Wall Street speculation and the buying and selling of stocks, which is essentially legalized gambling. And then you have commercial banks, which secure things like small business loans and home loans and college savings funds and retirement funds and things like that. And what the Glass-Steagall Act says basically is these two things, they need to be separate from one another. We don't want banks going in and taking money from mom and pop's retirement fund so that some hotshot on Wall Street can buy the latest stock. That's basically what the second and arguably the most important component of the Glass-Steagall Act does. Um, and it works for much of the remainder of the 20th century, even times when the country enters recessions in the 1970s and parts of the 1980s. The financial system remains relatively stable. But starting in the 1980s, this would eventually be bit by bit undone, culminating in 1999 with the complete repeal of the part of the Glass-Steagall Act that required a separation of investment and commercial banking. And many today consider that to be one of the, if not chief causes, certainly one of the causes of the 2008 financial collapse. So it's one of those things that many have since advocated reinstating in the years since to prevent such future financial collapses. Now, once the Glass-Steagall Act is passed and all the details of it are finalized, FDR decides to do something not necessarily new, but he goes about doing it in a new way. He decides he's going to explain this legislation to the American people. And he does so by going on the radio waves, taking advantage of the new mass media infrastructure that's been created with the widespread adoption of radio by millions of Americans. And so he delivers the first of what come to be known as fireside chats, these weekly radio addresses that he delivers to the American people, which are delivered in a very, kind of casual, easygoing manner, and where Roosevelt breaks down oftentimes very complex pieces of legislation, like, for example, banking regulation, which is inherently confusing. And he's able to explain these things to regular people in a manner that builds support for these measures and reassures people. And it's part of how Roosevelt builds this very strong, oftentimes deeply personal connection with everyday people. His weekly radio addresses, these fireside chats that he delivers week after week, explaining pieces of legislation or talking about important news, really do forge a very strong and very personal bond between the president and the people of the country, which is really not something we've seen since in terms of that kind of relationship. Another factor that helps build this sense of intimacy between Roosevelt and the American people during this time period is the actions of his wife, Eleanor. Eleanor Roosevelt, his first lady, is certainly very, very important to the New Deal, and in many cases in pushing her husband in directions politically that he otherwise was not willing to take. Their relationship as a married couple was kind of rocky, owing to a 1918 extramarital affair on Franklin Roosevelt's part. But as a political partnership, they're one of the most successful power couples in American history. She basically becomes the eyes and ears of Roosevelt, traveling to parts of the country that, because of either prior commitments in Washington or because more often than not because of his physical limitations and disabilities, that he can't go himself. and she interacts with people of all walks of life. Sharecroppers, factory workers, poor whites, African Americans, people of all races, women, and she brings back reports to the White House that talk about what people want, and again, it helps build this very strong personal connection. Millions of people write letters to the White House during this time period. And what's interesting is that nearly as many letters are addressed to Eleanor Roosevelt as are addressed to her husband, Franklin Roosevelt. So it's this very strong, very personal relationship that is built during this time period, which is, of course, one of the reasons why when Roosevelt dies in 1945, there's this just intense and prolonged and very public period of mourning that follows that. Um, so, through use of new means of mass communication, as well as Eleanor Roosevelt's efforts to build a very strong public interface and advocate for various groups and causes that might otherwise escape Roosevelt's attention, FDR's attention. There's this very strong relationship that is built. Now, generally speaking, like I said, the reforms of the 100 Days are kind of a mixed bag. Some of them are very successful and very popular, like the Glass-Steagall Act, which, as I mentioned, remains in effect. Parts of it still remain in effect, but remains largely intact until the end of the 20th century. Um, and there are other programs that prove to be very popular as well. In addition to the Glass-Steagall Act, another very successful component of the 100 Days or First New Deal programs are public works programs that Roosevelt expands. There were already a sizable number of public works programs under his predecessor, Herbert Hoover, including, of course, famously the dam on the Colorado River that would eventually bear his name. But FDR dramatically expands public works during this time period to provide employment opportunities to millions of Americans who really just want to be able to restore some dignity to themselves through work. Most people at this time, they're not looking for the government to just give them money. They want to be able to go back to work and provide for their families. They want the dignity that work provides them. And so these public works programs prove to be very popular. One of them is a program known as the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC. And basically, what the CCC is a program it's a civilian program, as its name suggests, but it's run by the Army, and it's run in many ways like an Army camp. You get the idea is to attract young, primarily single, unmarried workers, mostly men, also, but some women at Eleanor's insistence. And you basically you put them in these camps that, again, are supervised by the Army around the country, and you put them in place on building projects, specifically conservation programs like planting trees and building hiking paths and trails and roads to connect people to these new, recreation areas. Much of the national forests that exist east of the Mississippi River are planted during this time period. Significant portions of the Smoky Mountains, believe it or not, were actually completely devoid of trees prior to the 1930s because of extensive logging operations. This had produced a number of environmental disasters, including a massive flood in 1927 that killed a large number of people due to soil erosion. And so one of the purposes of the CCC was not only to put people back to work, but also to aid ecological efforts, to check soil erosion, and to just generally beautify parts of the country. More than 1 billion trees are planted by CCC workers during this time period. And their legacy is to this day one of the most visible elements of the New Deal era. Almost every public park, or almost every state park, I should say, that exists, or a large majority of them anyway, can trace their origins back to the Civilian Conservation Corps. So we're talking places like Pierre Marquette State Park across the river in Illinois, many of the state parks in Missouri. A lot of these sorts of things can be traced to CCC. Another unintended consequence of the CCC is that because many of the young men that were assembled in these Civilian Conservation Corps camps were under Army supervision, it provided a ready pool of individuals who could then be rapidly inducted into military service and turned into officers and NCOs once World War II began. So it provided kind of this cadre that would later prove to be very important in building up the American military during World War II. Again, that wasn't an intended consequence, but it was definitely something that in the long run came in pretty handy for the U.S. after 1941. Now, in addition to the Civilian Conservation Corps, another very successful and very popular New Deal program is this program in the southeastern United States, in Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, parts of Louisiana, and Georgia, to provide electricity to millions of Americans. One of the biggest legacies of the New Deal is the fact that, all of America, not just urban America, but rural America as well, gains access to electricity. At the time that Franklin Roosevelt became president, 90% of rural Americans lacked electricity and running water and indoor plumbing. As a result of programs like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which built this massive series of hydroelectric dams on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers in the southeastern United States, millions of people who previously lacked both of those things, both running water and electricity, suddenly have both. You couple that with things like rural electrification programs that accompany them, and the result is a dramatic increase and improvement in the standard of living for millions of people. This also, much like the Civilian Conservation Corps, will turn in to be very handy during World War II, as large numbers of war-related industries would relocate to the southeastern United States and bring along with them their workforce to that part of the country, something which would not have been possible without the infrastructure created as a result of programs like the TVA. It would also bring about, after World War II, a massive population shift as millions of people move to what comes to be known as the Sun Belt after World War II. Again, courtesy of this infrastructure that comes into existence as a result of the New Deal. So those are some of the successes of the New Deal. Programs like banking reform, as well as public works programs like the CCC and the TVA, and rural electrification and things like that. But not everything that is done during the 100 days is successful. One notable and rather sizable failure to occur during this early period involves basically Roosevelt's effort to reach out to America's industrial and business leaders. Many of America's business and industrial leaders regarded Franklin Roosevelt, who of course was born into a wealthy family, as a traitor to his class, with his clear identification and support for policies that benefited working people. And so part of Roosevelt's effort at sort of extending an olive branch to American business leaders was through this program known as the National Recovery Administration, or NRA, not to be confused with the National Rifle Association. And basically what the NRA did, or tried to do, I should say, is basically it creates this new mechanism. It's first off, the program's entirely voluntary. And basically the idea is that you get companies like, say, for example, automobile or radio manufacturers or something like that. and you get textile manufacturers too. And you encourage them to join these voluntary associations that the NRA creates because they can then attract consumers by being able to put this logo on their merchandise, the NRA Blue Eagle, to let consumers know this is a company that's participating in this program. And what the participation in the program involved was basically in exchange for the federal government significantly relaxing antitrust regulations involving price fixing and mergers and things like that. Companies basically got to draw up their own internal, um, kind of governance for their respective industries. These were known as codes. So basically, each industry got to set things amongst themselves for things like hours and wages and working conditions and prices for their goods, so that there wasn't this constant, cutthroat competition between one another. Fundamentally, the purpose of the NRA was to reduce what many in the New Deal, in the Roosevelt administration, saw as excessive competition in American industry. And as part of the process of writing these codes, in exchange for being able to basically set prices and wages and hours, these companies would ostensibly then offer some benefits to workers, healthcare, or allowing workers to organize and form unions. In reality, the program does not go as planned. For one thing, many of the people who are involved in it are very cynical about what they're going to do with it. They're going to do what they want to do to empower themselves, not their workers. And so, in fact, many industries adopt codes that are actually even more hostile to unionization, even more hostile to workers than the conditions that prevailed before. And most notably, this is the case in the textile industry in the South. And so this ends up being somewhat of a boondoggle that completely fails in its stated objective. It doesn't lessen the antagonism that many in industry feel towards Roosevelt or his administration, and it really doesn't do much to help workers in terms of securing better working conditions or pay or anything like that. And so it ends up being a pretty big failure. Eventually, in 1935, the Supreme Court declares it unconstitutional. So the NRA is really one of the kind of standout failures of the early New Deal. Now, other components of the 100 Days don't necessarily fail quite as spectacularly as the NRA does, but they do definitely end up having some rather significant unintended consequences that prove, in some cases, almost worse than the issues that they were designed to fix. And a good case in point for this is the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which is another early New Deal program designed to address what Roosevelt and his advisors considered a central cause of the Depression, which was overproduction and underconsumption. Basically, during the 1920s, in the aftermath of the First World War, when many American farmers had been encouraged by the government to expand their production, to buy expensive pieces of equipment, to put more land in use to feed the war effort. Basically, once World War I ended, and as Europe's farming economy returned to normal, as its agricultural economy returned to normal, the supply very quickly outstrips the demand. And you end up having a situation where many farmers are producing way more than the market actually needs at the time period. And so as a result of this, throughout the 1920s, there have been a steady drop in both the price of farm commodities, agricultural commodities, as well as in the wages of farm workers. And as a result of this, millions of farmers lost their farms during the 1920s and in the early 1930s due to foreclosure, because their incomes dropped And as farmers tried to compensate for decreased demand by increasing supply, it only furthered that vicious cycle of lowering prices and declining wages. And so, what the Agricultural Adjustment Act was designed fundamentally to do was to address this by quite literally paying farmers not to raise crops, something known as an allotment payment. Basically, the Roosevelt administration's idea was that instead of having excess supply that didn't match up with demand, that you would instead pay farmers to slash production, and in doing so, eventually supply and demand would even out with one another. Prices would stabilize, and farmers would once again be able to, live a productive and stable income for themselves. And that definitely works for a number of industries and for a number of farmers. There are many parts of the country, in the Midwest, for example, where large numbers of farmers are saved from the brink of foreclosure because of this, because of their ability to hold off on production, to receive commodity credit loans from the government, to hold them over during times of scarcity, and to wait for demand and supply to even out with one another. But for many others, this proves to be very problematic. The first big problem with this is that, you know, in spite of, the whole rules of supply and demand, the fact of the matter is that in the early 1930s, millions of Americans are still going to bed going to bed every night with empty bellies, with hungry bellies, and basically at a time of uh, widespread privation and starvation in some instances. The Agricultural Adjustment Act basically incentivizes farmers to burn crops or slaughter livestock to qualify for these allotment payments. And so, again, you have this image very graphically captured in John Steinbeck's 1939 novel, The Grapes of Wrath, of farmers deliberately destroying food that could go to feed hungry people in order to qualify for these allotment payments and to not lose out on the profits that they could produce. So that's the first big problem that this produces. The second problem this produces is that um, the Agricultural Adjustment Act fails to recognize is that although about 40% of the American population in the 1930s is engaged in farm work, in many parts of the country, a lot of those people who work on farms don't actually own the land that they are working on. They're sharecroppers, tenant farmers. And so in the South, in particular, many wealthy Southern landlords, in an effort to qualify for those allotment payments, begin evicting sharecroppers and tenant farmers off their lands so that the land can be put, taken off of the market and put fallow so that they can qualify for those allotment payments. And so many tenant farmers and sharecroppers, some of the most vulnerable workers in the United States, disproportionately African Americans in parts of the rural South, are thrown off their land, off land that they'd worked in many cases for generations, as these wealthy landowners qualify for these allotment payments. And many of those tenant farmers and sharecroppers who are booted off the land so that their wealthy landowners can qualify for these government payments end up joining these vast armies, basically, these vast migrant caravans of workers setting out across Route 66 to California to try to find work in California's vast agricultural fields, basically taking up whatever menial work can come about for them as they go about doing this. And this is something that is further exacerbated by an ecological disaster known as the Dust Bowl. This strikes in the mid 1930s, basically a result of decades of wasteful agricultural practices and basically not adopting to the ecology of the region, that produces these massive dust storms that literally swallow up entire towns and basically destroy the crops in many parts of the Great Plains, in particular in Oklahoma, Kansas, and West Texas. And so that further adds to that massive army of millions of migrant workers heading to California, who come to be known commonly as Okies, because a large number are from Oklahoma, even though not all of them or even a majority are even from Oklahoma. Um, and so that provides yet another indelible image of the 30s. Ultimately, the consequences of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, specifically the unintended consequence of, further fueling mass starvation at a time when large numbers of people are without food, would later be addressed in subsequent revisions of the law passed later in the 1930s. But in the short run, this is something that ends up working for some people, but ends up actually making the situation objectively worse for many others. And because of this, American politics and eventually Roosevelt himself become more radical as time goes on. Many Americans increasingly begin looking for radical alternatives. Of course, Roosevelt's opponents in the Republican Party like to highlight the failures of the New Deal and what have you. But eventually, this will lead to a rather pronounced shift in the focus of the Roosevelt administration towards, after 1934, the creation of a new welfare state, a new series of social welfare programs that would prove to be one of the most significant aspects of the Depression and of the New Deal. And that's what we will talk about in the next video.